Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. Tonight we continue our look at marriage with a discussion of the two-profession marriage. My guests, Gail and Tom Parker, will tell us how they make their two-profession marriage work. Gail is president of Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont, and Tom is vice president. Welcome to the show, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, who were your role models when you were a kid? Did your mother work?
No, my mother didn't work. I think I've learned the term role model so late in life that I can't tell you when I was a kid what I thought a role model was. I suppose they were pretty traditional. That is, they were businessmen and lawyers and others.
What about the women?
Well, I think the women role, the roles that I saw women fulfilling were pretty traditional roles. I did not know, as I think about it, I don't think I knew any working women, really.
Your pediatrician.
My pediatrician.
You had a female pediatrician?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. No.
Gail, what about you?
I had a grandmother who worked all of her life, or all of her life that I knew her, and my mother went back to work, I suppose, when I was about 12, something like that. It's a little blurry in my mind, so that I saw her working, but I definitely saw my grandmother working. She was the career woman as opposed to someone who worked.
Did you want to be a mommy when you grew up?
Yes, among other things. I always had a category of other things, though.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, I think for a long time, probably ever since I went to school, I got the idea that I wanted to be a teacher. Probably showed profound hostility to anyone in charge, that I was going to win in the end and be a teacher. So that when I was in kindergarten, I wanted to teach kindergarten, and in 4th grade, I wanted to teach 4th grade, in high school, and of course when I got to college, I saw that I wanted to be a college teacher.
Where did you meet, Tom?
We met at Harvard. We were both undergraduates at Harvard together, and I guess we met in a classroom. It was a pretty stereotypical Harvard-Radcliffe marriage in the beginning, at least.
Did you have feelings about marriage before you got married? Did you have long conversations about what marriage was, and how realistic were you?
I think in retrospect, one of the things that has struck us, particularly when we have friends who are obviously either not married or just now considering getting married, and they will ask us, and how did you decide to get married? And the answer quite literally is, we don't know. I think that in 1964, when we got married, that the feeling that when you were in college and you had a feeling that you wanted to live together, that was the signal you wanted to get married. You didn't think much beyond that, except that you thought it would be more fun the next year after college to have an apartment together. And somehow along with that, it meant you had to go pick out the silver you wanted and so on. There was all this other paraphernalia. I feel quite sure that if we were just graduating from college now, that automatic connection wouldn't occur. We would have to think harder about what it might be like to be married, but at the time we really didn't.
We went to a conference at Princeton 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, and there were lots of students there, and they were asking us questions like, how did you plan it out? How did you make this decision to have a two-career marriage and so on? And I think we were terribly disappointing, because the fact is we didn't plan it out very carefully.
Happened.
And yet they were thinking about those issues much more carefully than we ever had. And so we looked like, and indeed are, kind of fluke. We don't really count in their eyes, because they've been through all kinds of agonies trying to figure out how they want to run their marriages. It's interesting, I said marriages in the plural.
Well, isn't it supposed to be true that there are 2 marriages in every marriage or something?
At least, I suppose.
Your marriage and his marriage and everyone else's. Did your careers grow at the same rate?
Well, I'm trying to think what rate our careers grew at, if at all. We certainly we were both working all the time, although I went right on to regular graduate school, and Tom took a detour through high school teaching, which meant there was a period where I was in school and he was in the outside world, more or less, and then he came back in to finish up at his graduate work at Harvard. But I don't ever remember having the feeling that one of us had leapt ahead of the other. In fact, we both kind of moved along.
It is true, though, that in the beginning I had a job. I was working 9 to 5. And Gail, while she was doing some teaching, she was doing teaching as a graduate student.
That's right. I went to the library.
That's right. And so I looked a little more, I put on a suit and tie in the morning, for instance.
Very straight of you.
I didn't know anything else to do at the time.
But at no point did either of you have to give up what you were doing so that the other person could progress.
No, and I think that was one of the real advantages and one of the main reasons that we stayed around Harvard, that we stayed in Cambridge. It was the kind of environment that would support two people like us, and I don't just mean financially. It really gave us something rather interesting to do. And by staying there, we were able to both keep doing things that we were interested in. I think that it would have been much more problematic had someone, come in and said to either Tom or me, how about a great job in Cincinnati? And then we really would have had to have faced relocation. As long as you stayed in the same environment, we were very good at getting the next job because we had networks and so on.
Well, and it was a great advantage in that we really weren't doing the same thing. I think it's more difficult if a married or unmarried couple is pursuing the same professional interest or the same field of study or the same anything, then there can be problems of competition and certainly problems of job. There are only so many jobs in the same category in any community.
But you've never felt that?
Well, we were doing different things in certain ways. We were on different forks of the same academic road.
Yes, certainly. I mean, this is most dramatic in an academic community where you see people who tend to meet and decide to marry in part because they are in the same field, and so you get two Shakespearean scholars. Well, now when they try to find jobs, they are obviously in competition in a way that we never have been. There's never been that question of we want the same job. We've never coveted the same job, and that probably makes it a lot easier.
Was there ever a question about having children? Did you spend hours and hours discussing that?
That's the other question, that we look like such slobs.
Yeah, we had the same,
we can hardly
same
bear
boring
to
answer to
proceed.
that question. No, I don't think we did. I mean, I think
After we had a child, we began to think about whether we were going to have another, and that may be that when that consciousness intruded, that may well be why we only have one child. But we certainly came to that notion that it was a question about having children quite late, indeed after the fact of having had one.
You had Julia, is her name.
That's right.
Well, you were in graduate school.
Yes, we'd been married less than 2 years when we had Julia.
At that time, did you have feelings about this is going to stop me, and did you feel the pregnancy or rearing a child was going to interfere with what you wanted? Did you have any of those negative kinds of feelings?
No, I remember, as a matter of fact, having a conversation with Tom's mother when I'd first discovered I was pregnant, and we were at his home in Oklahoma, and she said something like, well, how are you going to feel about stopping school? And I said, huh, because it just had never occurred to me that I was going to stop going to school. I had a kind of fantasy about having a child, and by fantasy I don't mean it didn't come true. I'm just talking about that state of mind before she was born, where I looked forward to having a baby because I'd been doing the same thing for so many years. That is, I'd been an undergraduate in a field, and I'd gone on to graduate school at the same school in the same field, and I was very much looking for diversion. I thought there must be qualities that I had that would be elicited by a child that weren't elicited by graduate school, which is to say almost any human quality you can name, because I don't think graduate school is a great place for nurturing the human personality. And so I liked the idea that there would be a little break. I don't mean that I would stop going to school, but that I'd be doing something else, at least with one hand while I went to school with the other.
Did you take all the care of her, or is it a thing that you shared?
Oh, we shared, but Gail did most.
Now explain that,
Well,
Tom.
you said there's another option there besides Gail doing it all and sharing, and that is Gail doing most of it.
A gratifying option. In fact, when Julia was born, I was a graduate student, and Tom was teaching full-time, which meant he got up at 6:15 in the morning, and he got out to this high school at about 7:30 and came home at about 4:30. And my life obviously was more flexible, so the sensible thing, in fact, was, and I'm sure if we had it to do all over again and were in anything like analogous positions, the same thing would happen all over again, despite new consciousness. We took the money here in teaching high school and got a babysitter part of the time. And the rest of the time, I was around. But as I do say, this was something of my own doing. I wanted to be around. I definitely saw her as an option, as opposed to, you know, something I wanted to have but basically not deal with.
So you never felt there's a certain person around here who isn't doing his share?
I don't think so, but then I have a
No.
kind of competence mania, and it means that I'm very slow to notice that other people aren't doing their share. I don't want them to do my share.
Division of labor has always been pretty easy for us, I think. It may have something to do with we both have a certain instinct to keep the house clean, which, I mean, it may be as simple as that, I think, but I don't know. Lately, I've begun to think there are occasions when I think that I am doing more of those domestic things, and I must say I'm getting some pleasure out of it. I'm getting some, because if it's true that I felt guilty earlier, then now I can assuage that guilt by
Playing
doing
makeup
more.
ball.
I suspect this is all in our heads.
Do you recall ever feeling guilty, though, really?
Well, I don't know. I certainly had that kind of guilt that means that you get up in the middle of the night, too. But even though there's really no reason to be up in the middle of the night, but, you feel that it's unfair if you wake up rested and relaxed the next morning. I remember that from the early days of child rearing.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned competition. Are you competitive with each other? Do you compete?
I don't think so. I think we compete with
Everybody
the world
else.
around us. But one of the things that certainly happens in the situation where we are now, where we are in a small, very good college, in which we're them. You know, we're the ones whose fault it is, whatever. And I think if you're in that situation, you draw together pretty closely.
Certainly do.
That's right. We'd be fools, obviously, to carpet each other in
That's
public
right.
when we need our supporters.
Or even in private. I mean, it's hard to carp in private when you have to spend so much of your energy coping with people who want X, Y, or Z.
How did you come to be partners, and how did you come to Bennington?
They asked us. I know that sounds like a stupid response, but it's
You
quite
didn't
literally
apply for the
true.
job or something
No.
like that?
As a matter of fact, in sort of high academic etiquette, one never applies.
that
One
sort
is
of job.
called.
Right.
That's right. To come. And they had a very elaborate search process, and somehow in casting their nets, they hauled us in, and we went through all sorts of interviews and re-interviews and talking to, we thought, every man, woman, and child in a 50-mile radius around Bennington College before they finally made their decision, which in fact probably was good for us because it gave us about 5 months, something like that, during this process to really think what it would be like. And for a long time, we had qualms. We had, among other things, qualms about whether our personalities could ever stand leaving Harvard after 12 years. And we had qualms about, what it would be like to live in the woods, in effect, when you've been used to an urban setting. But I think about 2 weeks before they announced the decision, we realized that we couldn't remember what our qualms were anymore. And then we knew we were in trouble because we really wanted the jobs.
Were you both to be either president or vice president, or was that something that was determined from the very beginning that you knew? Was that something that was defined for you initially?
Well, it was obvious in that Gail was clearly the academic, and Bennington is the kind of place where a president would have to be very academically competent. And my experience was administrative in a more bureaucratic sense of that term. Gail was not inexperienced as an administrator, but her administration was more academic administration. So it was pretty clear that I was not going to be the president. If I were to be the president of a college, it would have to be a college where the faculty were less demanding about the academic qualifications of its president. And there are such places.
Tom, do you take a lot of heat about the fact that Gail is president and you're vice president?
Well, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, I think I take less heat than there really is, because people who feel that there's something wrong with that usually are embarrassed to bring it up. Consciousness is just enough now, so that...
so you don't feel these little...
That's right. People don't talk about it in the way that they might think about it. I can't tell you what they think about it, because then...
Although once we
I'm
were
not
on
privy.
a television show, I guess in Albany, and people called in. It was one of those things where they called in, and after we'd done what we thought was our wonderful little presentation of self and what we did, and the person talking to us had carefully said, and she's the president and he's the vice president. The first call that came in was, well, Tom, how would you feel if she were the president and you were the vice president? And we started all over again having to explain. It was clear that this, the person watching simply could not hear that when it was said so clearly that I was the president and he was the vice president. They had to switch it.
A lot of people, our own alumni included, insist on thinking of us as co-presidents. In order to get around the notion that Gail is the president and I'm the vice president, there's this notion of equality, which we correct when it comes up, but it's hard for people to buy.
Were either of you ever concerned that this kind of situation would put a pressure on your marriage that it couldn't bear?
We both have big egos. We can handle it.
I think that, one thing that's been known for a long time about women in our society is that we've been trained to think that it reflects very well on us to have an important husband, and that women don't go around flinching because their husbands are rich doctors or successful lawyers. Quite the contrary, they believe it adds a kind of luster to their lives ordinarily. And I think, one of the things that's happening is that there are more and more men in the world, perhaps not enough to go around, who have a feeling that it adds a kind of luster to their lives to have a woman who similarly is successful and probably not incidentally earns a good salary, which she presumably has the good grace to share with her mate. In other words, that feeling, so far I guess from Tom's feeling or most of our friends' feeling, that it is a liability to have a wife who seems to be a little bit too successful. There are some people, and I think ourselves included, who really rather question, I don't know whether it's the strength or the human worth of a male who insists on having a wife who is lesser than he is. There's a kind of reverse snobbery going on.
I get a lot of credit. I had a perfectly decent and pleasant job as the vice president of a major American college, and I get credit for somehow sacrificing myself by having this good job. I mean, I'm delighted. I like what I do, and I don't...
It's an attractive form of martyrdom.
Yeah. And of course, it's the people who give me credit for somehow being good about this are by and large people whose values I share and whom I really like. The people who think that I'm somehow weak or second-rate because I will be the vice president to a wife who is the president, are people whose values I generally don't share. So it's not,
It's not a problem.
I don't think so. I really don't think so.
Gail, do people often wonder if you're the front for the two of you?
I have occasionally said that people's questions lead me to believe that they see him as kind of my manager and I'm his trained bear. He, in his infinite cunning, has found a good act. That's me, and he sends me out, but he's behind, sort of taking the paychecks and setting up things as if he were my agent at all times. And I think that is a model that people have for understanding what seem to them anomalous or intolerable power relationships, that you say, well, of course, this is the front woman, and behind the scenes there is a masterful creature.
Do you ever have trouble with people not accepting your authority because you're female?
I don't think I have any trouble sort of on my own territory. I certainly have had, a number of situations which I, in some cases, am cruel enough to prolong, where individuals clearly mistake me for someone else, whether as my own secretary or a kind of aging student or whatever, and I must admit I torment them a little. I'll let them go pretty far before I'll say to them, well, now. Of course, then the shock is so great, so overwhelming. But I think on the whole, I don't have the sense, but it may be that I'm naive or that I block it, that most of the people at Bennington College think to themselves, oh, there goes that young woman president. The adjectives have gone away. The president part may have gone away. They may have such, whatever they think of me, they may capsulize in other forms.
One sort of common complaint that many people who have marriages in which there are two careers have is that there's so much time that's spent at home working out the logistics of the two careers that there's not very much time that gets spent on the marriage. Do you find that that's at all true?
Well, I think there's not very much time that is spent on doing those. We have a terrible time figuring out how to find time to cook, clean, shine our shoes, sort of do those things that one ordinarily does. So we do not have a traditional wife, and that's a problem in some ways. I mean, because there are certain things that you like to get done. But I think the deeper question about whether it affects the marriage itself can be played both ways. Either the answer is yes, you spend so much time talking shop and doing the logistics of the professions that you never really get to know each other, or the other way, you get to know each other better because you know much more about what each other are up to and you see each other more. We probably see each other. Those surveys about how infrequently married people actually talk to each other. And there are a whole series of studies indicating that married people, in traditional marriages, people do not say very many words to each other. And certainly that's not a problem.
Whether the
if you're
quality
working
of
together.
our words is more.
That's right. Now, I can't vouch for the quality. Someone who sat in a corner like a mouse would have to make an observation about the quality of the conversations we have.
Well, I think that's one explanation for why the logistics business is one explanation for why we so far have only managed to have one child, is that there is that tendency, particularly when there's a child involved, to be like ships passing in the night where you're constantly trading the child. When you're home, the other one by definition has to be away, because that's in effect how you cover the home front and get the babysitting done and make sure that the child is not abandoned in this world. And I think that is a real problem. That is a real problem of arrangements. I think another reason we only have one child is exactly what Tom blurted out before, and that is that we do have rather large, whether you say egos, we are people who take up a lot of room. And when you see three Parkers together in one big house, you're rather glad probably they're not four, because we all three take up a lot of room.
How does she describe what you're doing? How does Julia describe it?
Well, she obviously doesn't describe it to us. That's not where we get to see that's not where we get the most objective view of how she describes it. I think you'd have to ask someone, you'd have to ask her best friend or her teacher. Or
she did say, as a matter of fact, the other day that she was quite incredulous. A friend of hers had insinuated that because Tom was the vice president and I was the president, that the vice president must be a better job.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And she's very quick to say that she thinks that there ought to be women everywhere, women presidents of the United States, and so on. She has a good line. She snorts at commercials with the best of us. And so she certainly has a raised consciousness about some things. But other than that, she thinks, we travel too much, and she has all the general complaints that a child would have without much political analysis.
Tom, you said something in an article in Ms. Magazine, and I assume you were quoted correctly, that the way you make it work is it takes an enormous amount of effort and a lot of coping. What did you mean by that?
Well, as an example, I can tell you that it is very difficult simply to convey to each other all the information we have to convey about where we're going to be when. And it's hard even for us to remember that we don't each know everything that the other has been through in a given day. And that's complicated even more by the fact that everybody else assumes that we both know everything that each other.
To have told one, it leaks through to the other.
We have separate offices. We frequently will go through a day not seeing each other because we're busy seeing the people we have to see to do our jobs. And then the next day, or even the next week, those people will come to the other and say, have you done anything about X? Well, we don't know. There's a lot of coping there. But also coping, I think the sense that I would use for what I think I meant by coping in the Ms. article has to do with tolerance, really. You have to, I don't think that's not peculiar to career marriages. That's peculiar to the world. Being married, living with anybody, it's hard work. You have to think about it.
Gail, you described your marriage as like people in their 50s. What did you mean by that?
It is horrible somehow to be caught up on the answers that you've given to questions as long ago. We have been known to say that one of the reasons, just in general, that we seem to still be married, while no one else we know is, had to do with the fact that at the age of 21 we were somehow 50-year-olds. And I'm not sure what are the implications, what we have in our minds about 50-year-old people. But I suppose to some degree it really has to do with liking to be with the other one, but letting them alone, not living through or with them. So that, for example, tomorrow morning when we get up and go into New York City, when we're not having appointments, you'll see Tom Parker walking one direction down Fifth Avenue and Gail Parker walking the other. And we're delighted, in effect. I don't want to say to be walking in opposite directions, but just to go about our own business. Really rather secret and private in the way I think many people whom you see are happily married but are 50 years old don't do that much with the other one. And that we've always had something like that.
Gail, we have
us.
30 seconds and I'd like to get in one quick question. There are a lot of colleges and universities that have policies against hiring husbands and wives. I assume that Bennington doesn't have that policy. But how do you feel about that?
It seems to me absolutely ridiculous, particularly when you would think that if a college or university coveted an individual, that individual's choice in a mate might mean that mate would be particularly attractive to the institution as well. I mean, it seems to me totally backwards.
I'm sorry, we're out of time.
All
Thank
right.
you, Gail and Tom Parker. Good night. See you next week.
Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.